Characters. Who are they? What are they? Who will they become? So much goes into the creation of a character, their backstory, culture, beliefs, image, eye color, description, personalities, and so much more. As readers, we only get a glimpse of what truly goes into each character. So grab a beverage and get comfortable as we explore this episode's character in depth with your host, Madilynn Dale. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Character Driven. I hope you all had a wonderful Halloween, and for those of you who didn't get to trick or treat or you took your kids, maybe you got to eat some candy. I don't know, but I have another fantastic guest for you guys with a wonderful character that I'm really excited to explore in depth. Before I bring him on, though, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Here at Go Indie Now, we have a ton of new stuff happening almost every day of the week, and we're continuing to grow and have even more available. But without further ado, let's meet tonight's guest.
Hello. Hey, how's things?
It's good. Hey, so go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell our listeners and viewers who you are and who we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, cool. So I'm Derek Power. I'm an author out of Ireland. I write the Filthy Henry comedy fantasy series. So Filthy Henry is probably best described as a detective that works magical cases. And all of his cases are based off Celtic myths and legends, which are near and dear to my heart. So we're going to go and deep dive into Filthy Henry tonight.
Yes, we are. And I interviewed Derek, guys, for a little backstory. A couple months back, I'm not even sure anymore. It's been a while, and got to learn a little bit about this story. But let's start with Filthy Henry's backstory. How does he find himself as a detective for these types of cases?
So Filthy Henry is a half human, half fairy. And because of that kind of blend of natures, he is able to live longer than a normal human. He kind of ages slower. So he's 100 years old at the current point in time of the story. So there's 5 books in the series at the moment. So he turned 100, I think, around book 2. And as he was trying to find his way in the world, he realized that the fairy world doesn't want him. He doesn't really feel like he fits into the human world. And he tried to fit into the human world by having normal jobs in his 20s and 30s, and it just never took. And the fairy world kind of is always kind of encroaching on the mortal world. So because of the rules, and there's a capital R there, which is like this magical force that governs my world. And because of the rules, when the fairy world and the mortal world collide, there needs to be a neutral party. And Filthy Henry kind of decided to nominate himself to be this bridge between the worlds. But he still needed to get money. He still needed to have food. And as a result, he set himself up as a detective. And he touts himself as being Ireland's first and foremost fairy detective. So some people view him as a bit of a con artist. Some people view him as a menace. He's all of these things. Because he really has like a huge chip on his shoulder that he doesn't get to belong in any world. His kind of, if he had one wish, he'd wish to be fully fairy. He'd wish to convert completely to be fairy. And that's the world he'd rather be in. But until that happens, he's quite happy to be this kind of like go between the two worlds. So what usually ends up happening is the fairies, for whatever reason, and generally it's the villainous kind of fairies, they will be interacting with the human world for nefarious reasons. And because mortals don't actually know that fairies are a thing, they look up on the internet, who can I get to help? Filthy Henry's the only name that appears. So he hires himself out and then he works as a detective and he solves the case of whatever's going on.
Ooh. So with him growing up, did he, like his life experience, did that encourage him to choose that? Or was this job more so because he couldn't figure out what else to do with himself?
So It was a case of the rules I've put up into the story is he's the only one of his kind. He's the only half breed in existence, which makes him the only human who can actually cast magic because of his fairy side. The rules in the story then are that the fairies, when they find out about these half breeds, they do everything in their power to kill them, because that's actual stuff from the Celtic legends. And if they survive to their first birthday, all bets are off then. You're not allowed to go after them anymore. So Filthy Henry is the first half-breed to ever survive to his first birthday. But afterwards, the fairy folk just made his life and his mother's life absolute torture. So he kind of took a bit of umbrage at this. And he then decided, I'm going to get involved in the fairy world as best I can. And I can't go fully into it. So how do I annoy them more? And it's by kind of being this almost like police force between the two. So there's a couple of short stories that I've written that are up on my podcast. And in those short stories, Filthy Henry gets involved with fairies that aren't actually doing anything evil. But what they are doing is impacting the mortals. So he kind of takes it upon himself almost to be like the champion for humans who can't cast magic. As well as kind of the champion in general for stopping fairies trying to take over the world or stuff. So detective, the reason he settled on the detective title is when the police force kind of started to form, for want of a better term, the fairy folk were like, we need to be involved in this because we need to know if mortals stumble upon our world. So Filthy Henry learned that in the Irish police force, there are fairies working undercover. They look like humans, they pretend they're humans, but when they find out there's a magical thing going on, they let the fairy folk know. And Filthy Henry decided, if I'm a detective, I can also work with the police force. And through his fairy contacts, he kind of gets a heads up when maybe there's a case coming down the pipe or there's a magical murder that he needs to get involved in, because they wouldn't necessarily give that to anybody. So he kind of felt like detective is the title that gets him that kind of behind the curtain of what goes on in the police force.
Oh, so he's probably never hurting for work then.
No, never. He is, though, a bit of a con artist as well. So he might get a phone call from an old granny or somebody who has lots of cats, and they'll go, I think I've got a ghost up in the attic, and he'll go open it. He'll discover that it's just, a window that's banging or something. And he'll charge them money for performing an exorcism because, they brought him out. So there was actually one of the stories, I think it's book 2, his partner, Shelley, opens up the story by giving out to him because he's after conning a granny out of some money for that exact kind of scenario. And then later on in the book, his partner makes him donate the money to a charity or something as kind of karma for being, you shouldn't be stealing money from grannies when you didn't actually perform any magic. So in many ways, Filthy Henry doesn't really have a moral compass. He has it in terms of he knows what's right and wrong, but only in terms of how the fairies should be behaving. But he himself would see no problem with taking money from somebody for doing no work. So his partner, Shelley, she kind of keeps him on the straight and narrow for goodness.
Wow. So is that kind of like a fairy trait coming out with that?
Yeah. So part of the lore of fairies from the Celtic legends is they always try and get one up on the people that they deal with. So whenever you talk with a fairy, in particular leprechauns, you need to be very precise with the words that you pick. And they're very precise with the words that they pick as well. Because if you wished for example, if you wished to live forever, that's actually a very open-ended wish to make. We don't think about that because we would go, I wish to live forever. And in our heads, it's, live forever and everything is fine. But a fairy could grant you that wish, but your body would start to decay and eventually you'd be just like a head in a jar or something. And technically, they let you live forever. So Filthy Henry kind of is like that. He's like, the wording has to be very precise and you have to think very carefully about what you say. So that's kind of from where the fairy side of things is. It's coming out in him, this kind of con artistry side of things.
Gotta love that. But that always makes things interesting when it comes to requests and everything. Even more so with bargains, right? You have to be very specific on the wordage or the verbiage.
Yeah, exactly. And even in the stories, when he's dealing with the fairies, if he's asking for a favor, he has to very precisely word what he's asking for and also what he's willing to pay. Because part of the Filthy Henry lore is Filthy Henry's not actually his real name. Because your name has power. And if you know what a person's real name is, you can do things. So when he's dealing with fairies, they'll they'll try and tease out some of his identity or something. So he has to be very careful with how he speaks, but he's also very careful with how he offers contracts, to the point that Shelley, his partner, when she talks to him, she has now in book 3, she started to do this. She started to pay attention to what he says as well. And she starts to call him on it. She goes like, hold on a second. What you've just said means ABC, but I asked you about 1, 2, 3, and you didn't give me the answer. So it's kind of like a character trait that I have evolving with the stories.
Oh, fascinating. So how did that work out between him and his mom as he grew up? Him having the fairy traits and her having the human thought process and everything.
So his mother, at the time of the stories, his mother is dead for about 50 years, and he visits her every Halloween. He drops off some flowers, and he uses a spell where he can talk to her ghost. So she tried up until his early 20s to kind of hide the whole fairy aspect from him, and she kind of hoped that maybe he'd grow up to be like just mortal. She kept the identity of his father from him as well. So the identity of his father is kind of in the fairy community. It's an open secret. Kind of everybody knows who it is, but nobody's officially confirmed it one way or the other. But his mother then, when he turned 20, she kind of realized that there's too much stuff going on around their house that they can't explain it. And she eventually lets on that it's fairies. This is how Filthy Henry kind of starts to develop his abilities then. The one thing that she kind of had to keep an eye on was when I was kind of coming up with the story, I didn't come up with a magic system. But I wanted to limit what Filthy Henry could do. So he's very skinny, but he eats constantly. And what's going on there is his fairy side converts food into mana or magical energies. But if he doesn't have enough food in his system, it just starts to convert his body. So so he always has to keep his magical energies topped up, and he always has to make sure he's eaten enough. So that was kind of one of the things his mother had to kind of keep on top of without letting on why she was constantly feeding him. But then when he eventually started to figure out he could cast magical spells, all bets were off.
Oh, man. Did he have somebody guide him as he started learning his magic?
No. So the way I've had him kind of learn his abilities is he stole books from the fairy folk. And then he kind of started to come up with ideas himself. So again, because his magic abilities are limited, what he can cast versus what a full-blooded fairy can cast are wildly different. So a protection spell, for example, a full-blooded fairy would just cast a dome of magical energy around them. Filthy Henry has to make little discs around his hands because he can only have so much, and it only lasts for 60 seconds and then he's out of energy. So Filthy Henry kind of, through experimentation, learned how to get the most out of his magic. So in book 2, he describes how if he casts a fireball kind of quickly, it's kind of like a real gun effect. It's like bang and gone. But if he has time to conjure one, he can make them more powerful, but it uses less of his magic because there's kind of less of an immediate outburst of energy. So he learned that through just experimentation and stuff. Likewise, he has the ability to teleport, but he can't, because if he teleports himself or somebody else, even a short distance, he's immediately out of magical energies, and then he's basically defenseless. So he usually uses his teleportation magic to maybe move a clue from one place to another, because that's kind of a smaller thing to move. But if he moves a whole person, it's an emergency situation that he's kind of getting into. So all of that came about through experimentation, and then through the stories, I explain how he experimented about these things and how he has these limitations, and he knows why he can't do everything that he can do.
Oh, wow. So with the magic kind of disappearing with situations like that, in any of the stories, has that put him in danger where he's done something and then had zero magic and is still facing off against something?
Yeah, I've actually had three scenarios. I've had a scenario where he teleported somebody away to safety, which then put him in danger because there was a vampire attacking him, and he wasn't able to kind of respond in kind. I've had then a situation where he totally and utterly depleted all of his magical energies, and it's kind of painted me into a little bit of a corner, but I've been kind of using it as like a series long mystery that I'm going to solve. And I know where it's going now as well. When he was absolutely and utterly out of magic, something happened to cause an emotional reaction. And suddenly he had all of this like raw magical power that he didn't know he had before. And that's because of who his father is. He was able to kind of draw on daddy's abundant magical supply. But once the emotion, the like raw rage disappeared, he's never been able to access it again because he's never gotten that angry again. It's almost like he like turned into like a magical Hulk, if you want a term of it. And then I've had one scenario where he actually ends up in a world or a realm where he has no access to his magic at all. So he's not in danger from the fairy side taking over, but he has to really rely on just his wits to figure out how to get out of the situation. So I do paint them into these little corners from time to time.
That is awesome. So at any point, is he completely at risk of becoming full fairy?
No, that can never happen.
Okay.
So for him to become a full fairy, it needs to be effectively it needs to be a wish granted by the king of the leprechauns. So the reasoning for that is when a wish is made, it doesn't actually create the thing. It moves the universe so that the thing you wished for is now just normal. So like it's a reality altering amount of magic. So Filthy Henry, for his entire life, has been trying to get a wish from the king of the leprechauns. And when he gets it, the idea is he's going to wish his mortal side away and become a full-blood fairy. The king of the leprechauns has hired Filthy Henry on two separate occasions. And both times the payment has been given that he can get one wish off the king of the leprechauns. And both times something happens in the story that Filthy Henry needs to use it for the greater good and not for himself.
Man. So he's just kind of like, well, there goes that chance again. Time. Gosh. Wow. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. Where did you get the inspiration for his character?
So I'm a big fan of, there was a comic book series called Hellblazer with John Constantine. And he's kind of like a street magician who does con artistry as well for a lot of the stuff that he works on. He didn't work as a detective. He kind of just goes around like with a massive chip on his shoulder. So I really liked that kind of character when I was younger and reading those comics. And then Jim Butcher's Dresden Files are also featuring a detective wizard. So I was kind of, when I was coming up with the kind of idea for what Filthy Henry was going to be, just something about those two characters kind of popped into my head. And then I was like, well, what if I had like an Irish version of them? So Filthy Henry kind of formed from that. Like he's a detective, he can cast magic. But then I'm a big fan of Doctor Who as well. And one of the things I really like about the Doctor character is the vast amount of mystery that viewers have for his history. Like we don't know who his parents are. We don't know what his actual history is. He is known to tell lies, even to his closest friends. So I was like, what if I did that? So that's why Filthy Henry's name isn't Filthy Henry. And I have this whole mystery kind of around that. And then I have the mystery around who his father is. And then, you know, these slow burning kind of questions that you can kind of come up with. So with all of that kind of form, that's where Filthy Henry came from. Kind of those three archetype characters.
Ooh, that I like that mix because those are all really fun, creative things put together. Just wow. So with him being who he is, what are some of the flaws that he has? And do they change as the story moves along?
So the initial flaws that I had with him, which have kind of been tampered down a little bit, was he was a lone wolf. He had no time for friends whatsoever. So in the first book, when he meets Shelley, who has become a main character in the series now, she kind of notices that he acts kind of very aloof, very abrasive. Even I kind of use Shelley in the series as the lens of the audience. So she can kind of ask the questions about the fairy world that the audience would ask, and then Filthy Henry explains them to her through to the audience and that way. So she would ask questions, and he would be a bit of a jackass over how he gave the answers to her. So as the series has evolved, she's kind of started to call him on that, and that's kind of tapered off a little bit. So a flaw that's being worked away from him. He does have a huge ego. So he always thinks he's the smartest person in the room. And in which case then he decides that he's not going to explain his solution to the problem in full detail, because he thinks everyone's just going to be amazed by how I do it. So in later books, I think book 4 and book 5, Shelley and Drew the Druid, who's another character that works with them regularly, they actually come up with the solutions before Filthy Henry does. And rather than kind of be impressed that they are able to do it, he gets he's emotionally hurt. His ego is damaged. But the ego is a big one for him. And I kind of keep that one around actually, because I think it gives a nice foil. If the other characters are able to save the day, and it's not always Filthy Henry, even though the stories are all about him. At the end of the day, if the other characters can do it, it kind of puts a little bit of humanity onto him to a certain degree. And then there's the dad mystery. He actually, I think he's figured out the answer at this stage. I say that like he's a person that I can talk to. I think he knows who his dad is though. And he doesn't want to share that information with anybody. So anytime anyone gets close to that topic, he shuts it down. So he's not kind of a very open person when it comes to friendships. And as a result, he has very few friends who he can call on when he's in trouble. So in book 4, for example, I think about half of the book, Filthy Henry actually isn't present because of something that's happened, but nobody cares. Nobody's really looking for him except for Shelley. And it's because, he's like this with people. He doesn't treat people like friends. They're just like extensions to work with. So, but I think having those flaws helps him kind of not necessarily come across as like a real person, but it shows that he's something to develop on as we go through the series.
Yeah. Do you feel like that's kind of a way that his humanity shows through as well?
It's definitely influenced by his humanity, and the loner aspect in particular, because he himself feels he doesn't belong in the fairy or the mortal world. Because if he tries to be full fairy in his current form, the fairy folk are constantly reminding him he's a half-breed. If he tries to fit into the mortal world and kind of like reject his fairy side, he doesn't feel like he belongs, because humans experience life without magic, whereas he knows magic is real and he knows it exists, and he knows that, yes, you have to go to the hospital when you're hurt, but he can heal himself with a bit of magic, so why would he bother? So he can't really relate to people. So his human side kind of is bringing that loner side out of him.
Ooh. Although healing yourself would cut down on the health bills, right? Like,
yes, but well, I described it one day where he tried to heal something, and healing magic healing magic and harmful magic kind of sit on a knife edge in his world. So if you don't know what you're doing, you can actually cause more harm than good. And if you really know what you're doing, you can cause a lot of harm. So he kind of uses his healing magic for like cuts and bruises more than like, legs falling off and stuff, because he knows what could go wrong if he tried to do it the other way.
Oh, man. Hopefully, does that ever happen? Does he ever like lose a limb that has to be put back on?
Not he hasn't done something like that, but there has been an occasion where he got stabbed in the stomach and he needed to figure out how to heal it. And as he tried to start to heal, he caused the wounds to get worse. And then kind of like as a last resort, he teleports himself to somebody who might be able to help. But of course, he's out of magic then. So he kind of, before he can explain what's going on, he passes out. So he's got a knife in his stomach that he's after causing more problems, and then he tries to teleport for help, and he's in a worse situation. So it was actually quite a fun scene to write.
Oh man, that is brutal. I mean, obviously they take care of him because he lives, right? So
Yeah.
golly. Wow. So he goes through all kinds of wounds and stuff then, but would that be like his most severe injury in the stories?
I've had him blown up, but he survived that with magical shields. I've had him stabbed. Trying to think of what else I've done to him. He's had a rough old time of it now, to be brutally honest. I've had a god do something to him as well. There was an evil god who imprisoned him in some stuff that wasn't particularly nice. So yeah, he's definitely gone through the mill under my tutelage.
Talk about tough main characters. He is up there with them because you have definitely put him through the ringer. Wow.
Yeah.
If he could meet you in person, what do you think he would do after all the stuff he's gone through?
Oh, I'm fairly sure he'd pay me back in kind. Like if he ever met me, I'd say I'd get stabbed and then he'd teleport me away before I could get some help. And yeah. I don't think it would be a good meeting.
Yeah, that could probably be a deadly confrontation for sure. Thankfully, you're the creator and he's the character, right? So,
yes.
But to balance all of that out, have you given him pretty much like a good heaping dose of happy moments, so to speak?
I'm kind of teasing a relationship between himself and a fairy character. And she kind of has stepped in on a number of occasions when things have gone bad. So I kind of portray it almost as a not platonic, but kind of like a friendly banter between the pair of them. But kind of in book 4 and in book 5, she's kind of stepped in when he really needed some help. And instead of asking for something from him or trying to make a fairy contract with him, she has kind of just stepped up to the plate and almost come across like as a friend. There's a hint in book 2 that they may have had a relationship in the past. And Shelley has tried to figure out if this is true or not, but neither of them is given a straight answer because fairies and fairy speak and they can get around it by doing all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a reward coming for Filthy at a certain point, maybe like book 8 or book 9. I'll kind of tee that one up nicely.
Yay! That's good because it definitely sounds like he could use like a break.
A little bit.
Man, awesome. Well, Derek, thank you so much for jumping on here with me on Character Driven today. Go ahead and tell our listeners and viewers where they can follow you and where they can snag copies of this series.
Yeah, so you can get copies of it digitally or in print from pretty much anywhere. Amazon is the usual good spot, but it's also on the Barnes & Noble's website and a few others like that. There is a podcast version of the first 3 books, which is free for anywhere. So Apple, Spotify, wherever you might go. On the podcast, we also have short stories that have never been published. So that's the only place you'll be able to get those. And then myself, for my sins, I'm on Twitter as DCPower_author. And my website is powerrights.com, WRITES.com.
Ooh, sweet. Well, guys, thank you for watching. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and remember, it's always time to go indie now.
Filthy Henry flicked the light switch beside the bathroom door, plunging the landing into darkness. Whatever was in that bedroom needed light to see. It did not matter who your parents were, an eyeball was an eyeball. The only difference was that some eyeballs could work better in less light than others. Luckily, Filthy Henry had a trick up his sleeve that helped him see in the dark, something that came from his innate magical nature. After all, to be a fairy detective, you needed to see through the veil that separated the 2 worlds. Otherwise, you were just some madman running around the place. He closed his eyes for a second and turned on his fairy vision, his second sight, that brought down the magical curtain and allowed him to see the man behind it. To be politically correct, it allowed him to see the fairy creatures that inhabited the world, the magical realm that existed right beside the normal world, hidden from sight. He opened his eyes and looked around. Immediately, the world brightened, becoming varying shades of blue. It was like wearing night vision goggles, only without the actual need to look like an idiot wearing night vision goggles. Filthy Henry did a quick magical reserve check. So far, he had only cast the silencing spell today, which barely cost any energy to begin with. This meant that he still had a practically full magical tank in him, more than enough to cast one big spell or a lot of little ones. Given the disturbances that Jane had told him about over the phone, there was nothing all that dangerous up in the room. It was going to be an open and shut case, but it always paid to be prepared. He crept over to the bedroom door and pressed his ear against it, listening for any movement coming from the other side. There was nothing to be heard. Reaching down, Filthy Henry took hold of the door handle and slowly turned it, opening the bedroom door as quietly as possible.